A little bit about who I am. Well, I'll start with a story. 1979, Jimmy Carter was president. That was a long time ago. I had brown hair and lots of it. And I came home for my first year of college, and my dad says to me, "I have found you a job." And I was like, "Oh, cool. I didn't know I was looking, but thank you." And what he had got me was a job as an assistant research person to a gentleman by the name of Dr. Tigner, who did research in trees and shrubs. And it was, as I said, 1979, and it was Oregon State University. I am from Oregon, and I'm from this little strip of the Willamette Valley known as a banana belt, and we grow more plant material in that portion of the county that represents such a diversity that Western Garden says that we have more plants in our area than any other area of the world. So it's quite a diversity and a great opportunity to get into the world of horticulture, which is where I am. I moved to Utah in the early 90s, about 91, and I have since been working as a consulting arborist, as an arborist. I've been president of the Utah Community Forest Council and been very active in the tree care community, as well as a landscape designer. I left behind in Oregon the years of being a landscape contractor. I was an estate gardener and a greenskeeper on a golf course. So when I bleed green. I am a horticulturist. So what I'm going to be talking about today is, all of the things that we see going on around us. As we drive down the road, we don't have to go very far. You may only have to go to your backyard to see some real stress situations with the shift in our weather patterns, with the issues that we have with our soils, et cetera, et cetera. It all seems to be amplifying, to be getting worse and worse as time goes by. Now, my introduction to what it was like gardening in Utah came shortly after I moved here, and I bought a house, and I was so excited I had no landscape, and I was remember I was doing landscape design and gardening back in Oregon, so I was ready to right. And what did I do? I grabbed my favorite shrub, the Washington state flower, a rhododendron. I went to the nursery, I bought 3 of them. I came home, I planted them in the ground, and they died. I'm like, wait, I'm a horticulturist, this can't be happening. But the pH of the soil for rhododendrons, the variety that I bought, is about 5.5 to 6. They love it acidic, like the blueberries and the rhododendrons and the dogwoods that we have growing in the Pacific Northwest. They love acidity. And little did I know that I was growing or trying to grow rhododendrons in an 8, almost an 8.5. Very alkaline soil. The rhododendrons were just, nope, not doing this. I swear, it wasn't 48 hours and it looked like they had been poisoned, which for all intents and purposes, they were. So that was for me. Welcome to Utah. Welcome to gardening in Utah. Another funny thing that happened about the same time, I worked for a company that you may remember called ChemLawn. ChemLawn sold out to what is now True Green. And I was up in Olympus Cove. It started raining. It was June. Let me repeat this. It was June. So I pulled over because I was in the tree care division and you don't spray when it's raining. So I pulled over, see if the rain will let up. Well, it started snowing. I was like, wait a minute, it's June. Where did I move to? What is this place? Once again, welcome to Utah. Welcome to gardening Utah. When they say this is the place, it is. This is the place if you love to ski. This is the place if you love to go hiking. and all the things that are fun about the mountains. If you love to garden, well, that's a different experience. And that's what I've been enjoying for, it created kind of a unique niche for me, because with all my horticultural experience, once I got a handle on what's going on with the soils and with the weather, it began to make sense to me, and it gave me an opportunity to become the consultant that I am today. So one of the things that I want to address right off the bat is the issue that we keep hearing about all the time this year, and that is water. People have been asked, well, apparently not the cemetery, because I took this picture this year. The cemetery is not having water problems. We've been asked to pull back on the water. Now, the scary thing about pulling back on the water now, despite the lovely rain that we've had for the last 48 hours, is the misconception about how much water trees and shrubs need. Because I want you to think for a minute, well, let's back up a little bit. 3 things that root systems and subsequently trees and shrubs need is nutrients. We all know that, like fertilizer and like loamy material in the soil. But they need oxygen and they need water. And you think, okay, is there any time during the year that they don't need those things? Well, one of the little secrets about trees, shrubs, most plants, is that dormancy happens, as we know, 6 months of the year practically, but dormancy happens from the ground up for that part of the plant that's exposed to the elements. But root systems don't go dormant. Root systems are still actively needing nutrients, oxygen, and water. So if we shut off the water to the lawn, we're also shutting off the water to the trees. And this is where I'm seeing, it's called winter drought stress. It's actually a thing. It's a thing that gets researched time and time again. And there's actually quite a bit of information out there about how trees go into a condition called winter drought stress. And then as they go into spring, that winter drought stress carries over, where diminished root systems that don't have enough water are suddenly needing to thrive, and they don't have enough water. You can let your lawn die. You can let your lawn die in the middle of the wintertime. You can let your lawn die in the middle of the summertime. And the reality is that growing a new lawn is not a complex proposition, and it doesn't take a great deal of time when you compare it to a shrub or even more, a tree. If, for example, one of these lovely trees at this cemetery had all of that grass die under it, and the ground begin to dry out, and then the tree die. Well, I can grow that lawn again in about 6 to 8 weeks. It's going to take me decades. Some of the trees at this cemetery, this is one on 33rd South in Highland, some of these trees are over 100 years old. You aren't going to grow a new tree in that 6 to 8 week period of time like you can on the lawn. So what do we do? Well, the reality of it is that anybody who is telling you right now that we can quit watering for the rest of the year, or we can quit watering to spring, is either providing misinformation or doesn't understand the nature of how roots work. So let's talk about how roots work. So roots, they need to take up nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, micronutrients, all those things. They can't do it without water. They need to grow. They need to spread out into the soil to seek out nutrients, to seek out areas of more oxygen, and anchor themselves so they don't blow over. All of these trees that you're looking at right here were right in that wind tunnel that came last year, and you see there isn't a single one of them that blew over. It's because of the structure of the root system. That doesn't happen without water. It doesn't, the root systems, they don't take up nutrients, they don't grow without water. And as I said, unless the ground is frozen, and that's the thing I didn't mention earlier, the ground, once it reaches a certain temperature, there will go into essentially suspended animation. They'll stop, but they're not dormant, because in dormancy, the upper portion of the tree, boy, that temperature can fluctuate 40 degrees, and it's not coming out of dormancy. You know, we have freezing days, we have days 25 degrees in the wintertime, and we'll have days of 45 degrees. Trees never coming out of dormancy. Root systems, if the ground does freeze, and a week later, it's 5 degrees warmer, those roots are active again. Those roots are still growing, still taking up nutrients, still taking up water. So while I'm on the topic of water, I want to talk about, well, what do we do? Because it's very unlikely that in the middle of the winter time, you're going to be able to water like this. The water's just simply not available. It's not going to run through your sprinkler systems. Your sprinkler systems are going to freeze and fail. And we don't want to do that. So what exactly is it that we do? And the best recommendation that I'm making to customers as I go out and I'm doing these diagnostics is make soaker hoses your friend. Soaker hoses are the black hoses that you can pick up at typically any garden center, any big box garden center, and the entire hose will allow water to sweat through the hose. So you put that hose around the drip line, that's the outer edge of the canopy of the tree. Don't put it up next to the trunk. There's virtually no roots that take up water next to a trunk. Put it out in the drip line, and I say once a month. Now, research out of University of Colorado says twice a month, but I'm saying at the very least, water once a month, good, deep. You just turn, hook a hose, not the soaker hose. You hook a regular garden hose up to your home, run that out to the soaker hose, and then let that run for 2-3 hours on just a half to a full turn of your spigot, and let it just kind of sweat through the garden hose or the soaker hose, and it will moisten the soil around the tree and allow it to continue those processes that I talked about. You can simply set your hose out and let her run. It's not, it just means that you're going to have to move it more frequently. But let's talk about water placement in the root system. And this applies to any time of year, not just when it's cold and it's winter. But if we take, for example, well, I'm going to jump up here on this piece of carpet because it's a great illustration. So I'm standing in the middle of this rug, and you can see that the rug goes from here to there. We're going to presume that that's the edge of my drip line, that I've got a canopy. I'm the trunk, and I've got a canopy that goes out to the edge of this rug. That's where I need to water. That's where I need to water all the time. Now, research has shown that however tall my tree is, at the top of my canopy, that height in distance is the same distance that my roots go out. So it's very likely that I've got roots clear out. But the most important, the targeted roots for watering, is right at the edge of the canopy. It's called the drip line. And it's called the drip line for a really good reason. Because the way nature has designed trees is to shed water when it rains, like it has the last couple of days. And it's designed to shed water to the edge of the canopy. And as the water drips off of there, that's where the roots that take up water typically develop. I want to dispel a couple of myths about tree roots and water. Tree roots don't grow down into an aquifer, they don't grow down into a water table. That's not how trees get water. Tree roots go shallow. If you remember any of the tree roots that you may have seen from the blowovers that happened, you can see it's almost pancake-like. Tree roots grow out 360 degrees around, just like the canopy does, and they go out far. As a matter of fact, sometimes tree roots do a better job of growing out and around than the canopy does. And so we get some nice tree roots. This is me hiking. I do a lot of hiking in the forest. And this is up Mill Creek Canyon. I love this shot because one of the things that is very misunderstood about tree roots is the idea that you can plant a tree too high. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute because I'm going to show you some trees that we're planting. But this tree, or this group of trees, is thriving, and look how much root system is up above the ground. But we'll get back to that in a minute. But this is not where the tree is getting water. Again, this is really the emphasis that I want to make here. So let's talk about tree roots and planting. First of all, it's not unusual for your tree to come from the nursery in a root ball or in a container. It's either one or the other. And I want to speak to the depth of planting, because remember I said that trees need three things: nutrients, water, and oxygen. So I want to talk about oxygen for a little bit. Oxygen in the roots. Now, you can see from the side of the hole that this is in one of the areas, not unlike most of the valley, it's very heavy clay, okay? This is another welcome to Utah gardening moment when, after moving to the house where I decided to sacrifice 3 rhododendrons, my daughter walks in one day and she said, "Look, Dad, what I made for you." And she made this cute little sculpture. And I said, "Well, where on earth did you get the clay?" And she said, "Oh, this is just dirt from the backyard." I was like, "What? My backyard is modeling clay?" And yeah, once again, I was shocked. At that time, I decided to do, there's kind of a old farmer's test to see how much clay, loam, sand, et cetera, that you have in your soil. And it's where you take a couple of cups of soil, you put it in like a mason jar, and you add 3/4 of the way up with water. You've got soil, and you put some Joy dish soap in it, and you shake it up, and you let it sit on the shelf for a day. And you come back, and those layers have separated. And the top layer is clay, and then it goes silt, sand, and loam. Well, I pretty much had modeling clay. So, to that point, clay is soil that is very, very difficult for roots to get oxygen out of when we keep it A, too wet, and B, when we put it in too deep to begin with. And though that what I've just told you is the number one thing that I find going wrong in landscapes and with new plantings is they get planted too deep. And right from the beginning, when a tree, presumably this fir here has come from the Pacific Northwest, where it had plenty of loam, it had plenty of oxygen in the ground, and I'm about to put it in this clay soil. So the first thing I want to do is make sure I'm not putting it in too deep. And as I said, as many times as I go onto a property and I look at a tree and I go, "Oops, planted that thing too deep." I have never, in all the years that I've been here in Utah, gone to a property and go, "Oh, you planted that too high." It doesn't happen. It is almost not a thing. Planting a tree too high should be the last thing anybody should ever worry about. It's not going to happen. So, what you want to look for, though, and oddly enough, I'm using this table here as an example, because if you look at the leg, the single leg on that table, when it gets to the very bottom and it goes into the stand, you see how the stand kind of flares out? Well, trees do the same thing. Trees have what's called a crown flare. And that's that transition point where the trunk goes into roots. And when I'm done with this planting, let's see if I actually have a picture of that. When I'm done with this planting, I want to see the crown flare. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a crown flare, where it transitions from trunk into roots. And remember what I said earlier about it's no such thing as planting too shallow? There is an illustration where I can see the surface roots, and this tree is thriving. This tree is loving life. It's not too shallow. And fortunately, as I talked about earlier, it's not in the ground too deep. So anytime I go on a consultation, I want to be able to see that transition point where the trunk flares out and goes into roots. I'm not concerned about seeing surface roots, not a problem. Oh, to surface roots. I didn't talk about this last show yesterday, but since it's on my mind, a lot of people call me out and ask me, you know what, this maple tree is putting roots out in my lawn. What can I do about that? Can I cut those roots off? No. Why would you do that? And a lot of the misconception is when we were talking about the clay before, the roots somehow are coming up to the top because they need water, oxygen, whatever the case may be. That's not true. What happens is the roots were at a certain depth to begin with, and just like the trunk and just like the branches in the tree, it gains girth. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger around. And all that you're seeing is the roots that were at the level they were when you planted it, and when they grew out into the surrounding landscape, just getting bigger around. They're not coming up to the surface. And research has shown that if I take even one of those roots away, if I cut it off because I'm bumping over it with my lawnmower or whatever the case may be, I'm going to severely impact the tree. I may actually lose the tree, but at the very least, I'm going to slow the growth and slow the progress of the tree. Anybody have any questions so far?
Just a side note, we have the opposite problem. We have sand.
You have sand.
We're at the base of big and little cottonwood canyons, and we moved from the house with clay, so we know what you're talking about. We're sinking.
Right. Yeah. Let me talk about sand here in just a second, because it creates a unique growing medium. Yeah, for all the clay that we have in the soil. I mean, like more soil profiles than the whole state of Ohio, just right here in Salt Lake Valley. And yeah, sand is one of those, like, what do we do with this? So yeah, I'll come back to that. You had a question?
Should it be above a certain temperature to water during those winter months?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So you don't want to be watering when there's a risk of it freezing, because you want the water to penetrate. You don't want to water when there's snow on the ground, because again, we want the water to penetrate the ground. So there isn't a month of the year that we don't have 40-degree temperature sometime in that month, and that's what I tell people. Just watch the forecast, and if it's going to be 40 degrees, that's your day to get out there and water. That's a great question, though, because another thing is that I tell people, if the ground's frozen, and you'll know it's frozen if you try to stick a screwdriver or a knife or something in the ground, it's just, it's hard. Everybody knows what frozen looks like. Don't water, because it's not going to penetrate into the ground. Research has shown that, getting back to my conversation about winter drought stress, research has shown that trees have actually gone into drought stress underneath that frozen layer of ground, but there was no way to water it, because there was no way to get, short of drilling down below that frost layer. So let's talk about, was there any other questions? Thanks for coming. So sand. Sand creates a unique situation because of how porous it is. So everything relative to watering seems to be amplified. and especially in our dry climate here. The thing that's funny about a tree receiving water is that it really only uses about 2% of that water for actual growth, for dissolving those nutrients, for the exchanges that are taking place in the soil. 98% of the water moves through the tree and out the leaves. The process is called transpiration. So in your sandy soils, you're faced with, quite frankly, using more water. One of the challenges that you face, because when I'm telling someone to identify whether or not they have enough water in the ground, is to scoop up a handful and squeeze it together, and if it stays together, then you've got enough water. Sand, depending on how much sand there is and how much loam or maybe a slight amount of clay, even in the wettest of conditions, we know, because if you're on the beach and you scoop up a handful of sand and you squeeze it together, it may not stay together at all if the particulates of sand are big enough. So the challenge there is real. I mean, you really just have to just kind of gather that up and feel it, hold it in your hand, and know that it is moist enough to be able to give up what it needs to the tree. There's a good chance that you're not going to overwater, depending on how sandy your soil is, because the water moves through it so easily. But there's a very significant chance that you might not water enough. Where I would be most concerned with that is during the hot part of the year. I would still only water maybe 2 times during the month of winter, but I wouldn't be overly concerned with putting on, or I would be overly concerned with the hot parts of the year. The amendment that I recommend to people, something like a Nutrimulch or something, get some composted mulch in the top couple inches of your soil, just to hold the moisture more. And then a couple inches on the top, again, it will keep that sandy soil from drying out too quickly. And because again, without moisture in the soil, the roots aren't doing nothing. So did that help at all? Okay. Yeah, that's, but truth be told, I'd rather have your soil than my soil. Clay soil is terrible, terrible. Okay, so we talked about the best place to water, and we talked about the drip line. That's where you want to be, but there really isn't any place within that canopy that you ever, in any month, want to allow to dry out. Because what happens to root systems in the way that those small little root hairs that take up water fail, in some cases they can take up to 6 weeks to regrow. And so nothing is there in that area taking up water. So you don't, getting back to my earlier illustration of letting the lawn die, well, okay, fine, just don't let the ground dry out because you're damaging or diminishing the roots. Earlier I showed you the picture of us planting. There was a root ball, and we were talking about the proper planting depth. One thing that I neglected to mention, but I see over and over and over again, is people seem to forget to take off the packing material. I can't remember ever buying a pair of shoes, and leaving them in the box and trying to wear them. That just doesn't make any sense, does it? And it never makes any sense to me why you would buy a tree and leave the packing material around it. It will kill the tree. This is the twine. Actually, I'll jump back here real quick. This is the twine that you see that my guy's removing from around the root ball. Not only does he remove the twine, but he removes the burlap and he removes the basket. So when it's all said and done, the only thing you see there is soil and roots. And when I go into a tree and I see this, I know I've got a problem. First of all, if you look low enough on the trunk there, you can actually see the trunk has been trying to expand and it's starting to leave a depression in there. If you ever inherit a situation like this, you immediately want to remove the twine, remove as much of the packing material as you can. Also, this becomes a problem when new trees are staked, especially out in the central and the south end of the valley. There's a lot of winds and people will stake trees and they'll put some type of tether up higher on the tree. I went out to do a diagnosis one day because the gentleman couldn't figure out why his tree that was 12 feet tall just broke in half all of a sudden. And what I discovered is at about 5 feet off the ground, nobody had ever removed that tether from the stake to the tree, and the tree tried to grow, and essentially it was a tourniquet, and it was about this big around, and the trunk was about this big around, and it just snapped off. Thank you so much for coming. I'm in booth 111 if you have more questions. Also, I have a YouTube channel, The James Batton Show, and I talk about these issues on my YouTube channel all the time. Thank you.